Hello, good evening. My name is Bea Kupin, and you are watching Rappler, and I will be giving to you, it will hopefully be a rather quick summary of the concluded meeting between Indonesia and the Philippines here in Manila and Makati City to be exact. Kanina kasi earlier this afternoon, Indonesia and Manila convened, or Indonesia and the Philippines convened the Joint Commission for Bilateral Cooperation, or the JCBC. Now, itong JCBC, this is the seventh iteration of the JCBC, hosted by the last time this happened was actually on February 26, 2014. So halos isang dekada na since the last time there was a ministerial meeting for the JCBC. This was preceded by the seventh JCBC. The seventh JCBC rather was preceded by a senior officials meeting, pero online lang yon back in April 2022. Now, ano ba tong JCBC na to? It is a mechanism to discuss and review basically bilateral discussions, agreements between Jakarta and Manila. So, in layman's terms, kumbaga parang siyang temp check kung where does Manila stand, where does Jakarta stand, what are the areas of cooperation, and what are the commonalities between the two Southeast Asian countries. So again, the last meeting, the sixth JCBC, was held in Jakarta back in 2014. Dapat nung 2018 magkakaroon ng meeting sa Manila, but delays apparently happened in between, and then something called the pandemic happened in between, leading to a near 9-year delay, or rather 5-6 year delay between the 7th and the 6th JCBC. So kanina, the Philippines was represented, or the delegation of the Philippines was led by Foreign Secretary Enrique Manalo, while Indonesia's delegation was led by its Foreign Affairs Minister Retno Marsudi. Marsudi flew in ahead of her president, Joko Widodo, or Jokowi's visit to Manila. Actually, it is January 9 at 6:30 right now. In an hour or so, Jokowi is expected to land at the Ninoy Aquino International Airport. And then tomorrow, on January 10, he is expected to visit Malacanang, where he will be joining a bilateral meeting with President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. So, JCBC ulit tayo. Nung last JCBC, inapprove ng Philippines at ng Indonesia yung Action Plan 2014-2016. Basically, that's paving the way for parang the direction of bilateral ties between the two countries. Now, this time earlier in Makati, they agreed upon the Plan of Action 2022 to 2027. Unfortunately, we do not have a copy quite yet of the Plan of Action. We will be reporting on it as soon as we get a copy of it. But we do have a gist of what was discussed during this meeting, and we'll be talking about that a little bit more later. So, quick facts lang. There are over 6,087 Filipinos living in Indonesia, according to the Department of Foreign Affairs of the Philippines. Indonesia is, or was, it's the outgoing chair of the ASEAN, which also explains why Indonesia was the host of the two ASEAN summits in 2023, both of which President Marcos attended. The first was in Labuan Bajo, the second was in Jakarta itself. Indonesia actually was the first country in which Marcos paid a state visit to, his first state visit as president of the Republic of the Philippines. Pero itong visit ni Jokowi this time is just an official visit to Manila, but there will be festivities in Malacanang tomorrow, and we will be covering that, so don't you worry. Okay. So yun nga, yung timing ng JCBC is quite maganda yung timing ng JCBC. So kumbaga, you have Manalo and Marsudi figuring out the path of Philippine and Indonesian ties ahead of Jokowi coming here to talk to Marcos again. Jokowi also is an outgoing president, of course. He will be running. He will not be running again in the next elections. And Rappler actually does have a story on his son, who is running for vice president in Indonesia, but that's another story altogether. Let's go back to the JCBC and Indonesian and Philippine ties. Okay, so yung plan of action 2022 to 2027, again, wala pang full text, but let's talk about like a gist of what it covers. So according to Manalo, it covers politics and security, border issues between the Philippines and Indonesia, regional and global issues, as well as judicial and consular issues between the Philippines and Indonesia. According to Marsudi, actually, there is a delegation of businessmen Here in the Philippines, kasabay ng visit niya at kasabay ng visit ni Jokowi from the Chamber of Commerce and Industry ng Indonesia, ostensibly, presumably holding business meetings alongside Filipino businessmen. So kumbaga side event yun during this Indonesian visit to Manila. Ano ba yung regional and global issues that the two talked about? They did mention it actually kanina during their joint press conference with Manalo and Marsudi. Top of mind, of course, Myanmar, our Southeast Asian neighbor, our fellow member of ASEAN. ASEAN has expressed in the past concern over the security, the human rights situation in Myanmar following the takeover of the junta. The two also expressed concern over the situation in the Middle East, although Marsudi was quite more direct in her statements, echoing previous statements by Indonesia, of course, saying that the atrocities of Israel must be stopped. But one major security issue that the two were sure to talk about, and they did actually talk about it earlier in Makati, was the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea. We do have a story on Rappler of Marsudi committing or saying that Indonesia is ready to work with Southeast Asia for the conclusion, the long-awaited conclusion of the code of conduct in the South China Sea between ASEAN and China. So magkakaroon tayo ng side discussion ulit. Ano ba tong COC na to? So yung COC, halos isang dekada na ASEAN nations, ASEAN member states, and China have been trying to negotiate a COC that would that all countries, all states would agree to. So COC basically would dictate how different ASEAN countries and China would function in the South China Sea. There are, of course, overlapping claims in the South China Sea, not to mention yung tensions between China and the Philippines, specifically in the West Philippine Sea or yung part of South China Sea within Philippine EEZ. In fairness, hindi ito first time siguro that a minister has expressed a desire to cooperate or willingness to cooperate or the urgency to conclude the COC, and China uh, is among those who recognizes na kailangan ng matapos yung COC. Yung problema lang dito, ano yung laman ng COC? Yung medyo madugong negotiations between ASEAN and China with regards to that COC. Um, for context lang din, back in December 30, 2023, right before the year ended, just as the holidays were commencing in the Philippines and all around the world, no, ASEAN ministers actually released a joint statement. I'm reading off the statement right now, maintaining and promoting stability in the maritime sphere in Southeast Asia. Now, the context of this, December 30 yung statement, pero earlier on in the month, was probably one of the tenser moments between China and the Philippines in the South China Sea, in the West Philippine Sea. So one weekend, back to back yun, December 9, December 10, if I'm not mistaken, there were water cannoning incidents, the China Coast Guard using water cannons against Philippine ships in Scarborough Shoal of Masinloc in Zambales, sa Baho de Masinloc, and also in Ayungin Shoal off the coast of Palawan during a resupply mission. Yung sa Scarborough naman, that was a humanitarian mission to help Filipino fishermen who were trying to fish in Baho de Masinloc. Keyword trying, because China often has been stopping Filipino fishermen from entering yung lagoon ng shoal ng Baho de Masinloc. So following that incident in the South China Sea, back to back, literally one day after another, ginamitan ng water cannon ng China Coast Guard yung Philippines. There were a flood of statements of condemnation, of concern, from countries who are either allied with or share common values and visions with the Philippines. But notably, as in other incidents in the West Philippine Sea, ASEAN was quite quiet on those incidents. And then the December 30 statement was released coming from the ASEAN foreign ministers. Now, in the statement, because we weren't able to talk about this. Well, I wasn't able to talk about this with you guys because it was break. So, yung gist ng statement na ito ng ASEAN ministers, one, again, affirming its commitment to international laws in order to maintain yung peace, security, stability in the region. Nabanggit din dito yung commitment to a peaceful resolution of disputes between countries. two countries or more than two countries in the South China Sea, uh, quote unquote, full respect for legal and diplomatic processes without resorting to the threat or use of force in accordance with international law, including the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea or UNCLOS. Bakit important ito? Or bakit ba malaking big deal ang South China Sea? Sasanga ulit tayo ng discussion. The South China Sea, aside from being a very rich resource for fishing, very rich yung maritime resources ng South China Sea. Another concern is that it's a major waterway for trade, not just for the region, but the world. Global concern siya actually, that you want navigation to be free. You want the South China Sea to be secure. Also in the ASEAN Foreign Minister statement, they expressed concern they said we closely follow with concern the recent development in the South China Sea that may undermine peace, security, and stability in the region. Again, making a mention of international law and UNCLOS. Also in the statement, a reiteration of the COC with China. And finally, ASEAN recognizing the importance of discussions or ties warming between the US and China. So if you recall, on the sidelines of a summit in San Francisco, Chinese President Xi Jinping and US President Joe Biden were able to speak to each other in a bilateral meeting. This was seen by many sectors, including especially those in the US and China, but also countries and sectors from around regions affected by tensions between those two superpowers, including ASEAN, na it was a welcome development, kasi nga yung superpower competition between US and China ultimately also affects the region as well. But at the same time, um, yun nga, parang we are closely also monitoring how Philippines and China's ties will be developing as the new year commences. And ultimately, what Marsudi said is that this statement from the foreign ministers um, lead to hopefully what ASEAN's vision is of a South China Sea that is a sea of peace, stability, and prosperity. You will hear that a lot when you hear when you're talking about Southeast Asian officials and ministers talking about the South China Sea. That is a shared vision, shared dream of the bloc when it comes to the South China Sea. Now, the elephant in the room or the potentially awkward or delicate conversation between Indonesia and the Philippines will always include Mary Jane Veloso. Of course, she's a Filipina who was arrested in Jakarta in 2010 after she unwittingly brought with her a suitcase packed with 2.6 kilograms of drugs. Within 6 months of her arrest, she was sentenced to the death penalty. She made headlines in the Philippines and globally even in 2015 kasi na-reject yung clemency request niya then and she was under the threat of execution in a Hail Mary move by the Philippine government then under the late Benigno Aquino III, the last-minute talks, and Mary Jane was saved at least from immediate execution. So yung stand ng Philippines ngayon under Manalo, under Marcos, is that the Philippines wants clemency for Mary Jane Veloso. When we asked Manalo ano yung response ng Indonesian government, basically they acknowledged the request of clemency. He already asked for clemency actually back in 2022 during Marcos's first state visit or his very first state visit to Indonesia. But in Manalo did note na kumbaga ngayon it will be up to Indonesia to decide on what to do with that long-standing request. We asked Manalo if this will be discussed during the bilateral meeting between um, Jokowi and Marcos tomorrow. And he basically answered na hindi niya alam. Sabi kung yun yung pag-uusapan bukas sa bilateral meeting in Malacanang. Speaking of, that's another thing that you will be and look forward to tomorrow. This time it won't be me, but my colleague, White De Leon, who will be talking about the visit to Jokowi to Malacanang tomorrow, January 10, and the expected bilateral meeting between Marcos and Jokowi in Malacanang again during his visit to Manila. Again, this has been Bea Cupin, reporting and giving you what is admittedly a long recap of the JCBC between Indonesia and the Philippines held in Manila earlier today. Keep it on Rappler. If you want to talk about the JCBC, if you want to talk about Indonesia, Philippines, Mary Jane, go to the Rappler app, meron tayong chat option doon, and you can actually discuss with other, readers, with Rappler reporters, even Rappler editors and thought leaders, to express your thoughts about Mary Jane Veloso, about diplomatic ties between Indonesia and the Philippines, ASEAN and China and the Philippines, whatever you have in mind. Again, thank you for watching this. I've been Kopit. You have been watching Rappler.